Following the funeral of my father, a prominent shareholder, tensions arose during the inheritance discussion when my brother-in-law abruptly interjected. He boldly asserted that both the stocks and the substantial $5 million inheritance should be awarded to my wife, the eldest daughter. This surprising claim left my sister and brother-in-law ecstatic, eagerly anticipating their financial gain. However, the lawyer, interrupting their excitement, sternly informed them that Kelly had no rightful claim to the inheritance. Let me provide some context about my life. I am John Watson, a 42-year-old sales worker with a wife and 2 children. My father, at the age of 78, remained actively involved in a certain company until his sudden demise. My older sister, Kelly, considerably older than me, had always been a source of trouble for our parents due to her problematic behavior. Despite reaching middle age, she continued to live without a stable job, acting as she pleased. I had long harbored a dislike for her and maintained my distance. The source of our current predicament began when Kelly turned 50 and introduced a man named Chris Adams as her fiancé. Despite his youthful appearance, Chris's indolent demeanor and unsavory ties raised doubts. Kelly, shamelessly demanding money from our father for the wedding, spent it quickly and requested more, causing our father considerable distress. Her justification: "It will all be mine in the future anyway, so what's the harm?" After just a year of marriage, our father collapsed while playing golf and passed away a few days later, leaving us in shock. Overwhelmed by grief, I took charge of funeral preparations, while Kelly showed no interest in helping. Exhausted after the funeral, my mother and I finally found a moment to rest. The following day, a lawyer arrived to discuss the inheritance, a matter for which my mother and I were already briefed. However, my sister and brother-in-law, oblivious to this information, barged into the conversation, making an audacious claim that the stocks and the $5 million inheritance belonged to my wife. The lawyer and I were left speechless by this unexpected declaration. My brother-in-law rejoiced, proclaiming his imminent wealth, but the lawyers swiftly crushed their hopes. Kelly, it turned out, had no biological relation to the late Mr. Watson. Shocked and perplexed, my sister confronted our mother, who admitted that Kelly was the child of her previous husband. My sister, who had teased me about being the favorite child since childhood, now wore an incredulous expression as the truth unfolded before her. However, my brother-in-law, insistent on Kelly's potential adoption rights, raised his voice, prompting her to affirm his claim. Our mother, however, shook her head, denying any legal adoption. The disbelief in my sister's eyes deepened as she protested the impossibility, asserting her status as the eldest daughter, a title even our late father had acknowledged. Furious and determined, she directed her glare at me, refusing to let me monopolize the inheritance. In irritation, I retorted, pointing out the substantial sums our father had spent on her behalf. My sister, undeterred, vehemently declared her entitlement, asserting her rights as his daughter. Her brother-in-law chimed in, supporting her protest and justifying the expenses as normal for a daughter. Sighing involuntarily, I clarified that ordinary expenditures would be acceptable, but my sister had utilized our father's funds to settle debts and legal troubles. At this juncture, the lawyer, who had remained silent, proposed revealing the contents of our father's will, an idea my sister initially resisted. However, faced with the undeniable importance of the matter, she reluctantly agreed to listen. The lawyer disclosed the will, explicitly stating that the inheritance was designated for me and her mother. It also revealed our father's initial intention to adopt my sister, only to be discouraged by her ill treatment towards me and her escalating reckless spending as she aged. Realizing she had no claim to the inheritance, my sister was stunned, expressing frustration and disbelief. In contrast, my brother-in-law, revealing his true colors, accused my sister of deceiving him, demanding she not return until she acquired wealth. He stormed out of the room, leaving my sister with a red face, glaring at us. She turned her anger towards our mother, questioning why she hadn't arranged for her adoption, deeming it unfair that only I received the inheritance. In response, I explained that fairness required consideration for her actions and financial irresponsibility. In a fit of despair, my sister, disheveled and sobbing, declared the situation unfair and terrible, leaving me taken aback by her alarming appearance. The lawyer, seemingly unfazed by the emotional turmoil, appeared accustomed to such scenes. When my sister questioned the reason behind my exclusive inheritance, I calmly explained, "Because I'm Dad's son." This response triggered an enraged reaction from my sister, who lunged at me, eyes widened in anger. In that moment, she expressed a sentiment that it would have been better if I had never existed. Deep down, I acknowledged that even if I hadn't been born, my father would likely have made the same decision considering my sister's behavior. Before I could respond, the lawyer intervened gently, warning my sister that her actions could escalate to a police matter. Flinching at the mention of the police, possibly due to her past shoplifting incidents, my sister, with a click of her tongue, left the room when our mother called her with tears in her eyes. Half a year passed, and the inheritance procedures were successfully completed without any issues. Despite some initial grumbling from my sister and brother-in-law, the lawyer's efficient handling prevented them from interfering. My mother, out of kindness, gave some money to my sister, a gesture I refrained from commenting on. However, what truly upset me was that they vanished with the money, displaying a blatant gold-digging attitude that disgusted our relatives who were aware of the situation. One day, I went out to eat with my mother, wife, and daughter. My mother, who had been somewhat withdrawn since my father's passing, appeared brighter in the company of her adorable granddaughter. My wife suggested that my mother move in with us, but I reminded her of the potential visits from my sister, who often came by to beg for money. Understanding my mother's hesitation, given the biological connection with my sister, I asked her to consider the idea and drove towards the family home to drop her off. Upon arriving at the supposedly empty house, we noticed lights on, despite it not being the time for the helper to be present. Suspecting my sister's return, I parked the car in the garage and suggested we stop by for a cup of coffee. As we approached the entrance, a car suddenly drove towards us, prompting me to instinctively shield my wife and daughter. Though the car grazed me, I was thrown against a nearby flower bed, feeling the impact on my body. The car came to a halt after hitting the garage entrance. In the midst of chaos, with my wife and daughter rushing to help me, we've learned that the driver was none other than Chris Adams, my brother-in-law. He claimed to the police that he mistook the accelerator for the brake, a story I found dubious. Later, I discovered that my mother and sister had come to the hospital. As our mother left the room to arrange flowers, my sister, with a cold look, expressed disappointment, remarking on my unexpected resilience. In that moment, I couldn't help but think that if I had been seriously injured, my mother would have inherited everything, a prospect that seemed to disappoint my sister. While speaking with a smirk, I revealed to my sister that my mother had decided to renounce her inheritance, asking me to pass it on to my wife and kids. This revelation surprised and baffled my sister, who found it incomprehensible that someone would willingly refuse what they could receive. To add to her shock, I explained that I had already made a will, following our father's example. This meant that, unfortunately, my share wouldn't go to our mom anymore. Unable to accept this, my sister trembled and shook as she pleaded for at least a portion of the $5 million inheritance. Firmly refusing her request, her face contorted into a demonic expression as she grabbed my collar. In an unusual and possibly deranged voice, she continued screaming, driven mad by her insatiable greed. In that moment, I couldn't help but reflect on how her avarice had disappointed our late father. My sister's face flushed with rage as she grabbed at my throat. The commotion attracted the attention of my mother, who returned and raised her voice in dismay. Nurses, alerted by the nurse call system, swiftly arrived to escort my sister out. Despite my mother's inclination to defend her, it became evident that my sister had directed insults even at our mother. Watching this painful exchange, I couldn't help but wonder where I had gone wrong in raising her. Shortly after, my mother was diagnosed with an illness, And as her health deteriorated, my wife and I took on responsibilities like transportation and household chores at the family home. Surprisingly, my sister, who likely encountered my wife during her visits for money or heard about our assistance from our mother, expressed displeasure. One day, my sister unexpectedly called me, declaring that she and her husband would now take care of our mother, and we were not needed. Confused and concerned, I questioned her abrupt decision, but she hung up, insisting it was already settled. Confirming with my wife, I discovered that she had received the same message. Apprehensive about my sister's ability to handle caregiving, especially considering her lack of experience in caring for a sick person or managing household chores, I hastily contacted my mother. Surprisingly, it turned out that my brother-in-law had some experience in caregiving. At the time, my mother seemed independent enough, providing a temporary relief. However, within a month, she was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance due to a medication dosage mistake. When our family arrived at the hospital, my mother appeared alarmingly frail. The doctor was puzzled, as she had never made such an error before. While my wife accompanied my mother, I went to the family home. Finding it in disarray, the fridge was empty, and the helper service had been unilaterally canceled. I felt ashamed for slightly trusting my sister and was infuriated to discover a significant amount of money withdrawn from my mother's bank account. Although the bank card and PIN were safe, fortunately, the account containing the inheritance was secure in a safe deposit box. However, almost all the money earmarked for living expenses had vanished. Taking necessary items for my mother's hospital stay along with her bank card, I returned to explain the situation. My mother seemed unaware of the bank card issue, but when I inquired about the medication mistake, she looked gloomy and revealed that it was prepared by my brother-in-law. Concerned about her well-being, I suggested that she live with us. Despite my intentions, her health worsened, possibly weakened by the incident with my sister. Ultimately, she never recovered and passed away, following my father's fate. When I returned to the family home to prepare for the funeral, I discovered that all valuables were missing, presumably taken by my sister and brother-in-law in their desperation for money. Standing in the empty house, I was stunned and overwhelmed with intense anger, vowing to make them pay for their actions. After my mother's funeral, my sister and I were scheduled to meet with the lawyer, presumably to discuss the inheritance. My sister confidently declared that the inheritance from Mom belonged to her, asserting her status as the daughter. I couldn't help but burst into laughter at her assumption, sensing her misunderstanding. When the lawyer revealed the will, my sister's face drained of color as she discovered that she wasn't set to inherit anything. My brother-in-law lashed out, questioning the lawyer's statement, but received the same response. Frustrated and angered, my brother-in-law swept things off the table, demanding the inheritance. Accusing him of attempting to harm my mom, he vehemently denied any involvement. However, I pointed out the unusual medication mistake, which left him annoyed and dismissive. My sister, spiraling into desperation, claimed she couldn't pay for her apartment and accused me of causing her insanity. To my shock, it seemed that instead of rushing over after hearing of our mother's death, my sister had been counting on the inheritance to cover her expenses. The lawyer explained the compulsory portion of the inheritance, but revealed that after accounting for the money my sister had withdrawn in items she sold, the remaining amount was almost zero. Dissatisfied, my sister scratched her head in frustration. Unbeknownst to my sister and my mother, most of the estate had been gifted to my daughters during her lifetime, leaving only a small amount available for inheritance. My sister, who had never experienced the hardships of work, seemed dissatisfied and muttered to herself. Expressing my hatred for her ungrateful behavior, I shouted at my sister, calling her a wretch. My sister, now facing financial troubles, couldn't provide receipts for the living costs she claimed to have covered for our mom. When I asked for detailed expenses, she turned pale and stammered, unable to produce any evidence. My brother-in-law tried to coax me into helping her, but I refused despite his persistence. Annoyed and frustrated, my brother-in-law lamented that if things had gone smoothly, My sister would have received the entire inheritance. Intrigued, I pressed him for more information, and he inadvertently revealed that he was supposed to get a new car but received barely enough for repairs. The lawyer, holding a recorder, smiled and informed them that the meeting was recorded, catching my brother-in-law off guard. Facing charges for the accident and other past misdemeanors, my brother-in-law would be under police care for a while. My sister, as an accomplice, faced a lesser sentence. Unable to pay for her apartment, she resorted to begging for money from relatives, only to be turned down by everyone. Meanwhile, I continued to work hard without relying on inheritance, finding pleasure in the anticipation of stock dividends.